This is the annual growth of mankind's CO2 output since 1940 till today. Currently, we are outputting 37.55 billion tonnes of CO2 a year, and that's growing at a rate of 1.1% every year and will continue to do so. The result of all this extra CO2, which is plant food, is having an incredibly good greening effect to our planet. The result is record world crops, even without any more land use. But some people cannot accept this good news story, and what this video is about is the people who want to actually bury CO2. It's called carbon capture and storage, which they call CCS for short. It must rank as the silliest of ideas, and it is what this video is about. But it's important before we start to understand some basic figures. So with 37.55 billion tonnes a year, growing at 1.1%, we get a growth alone of 413 million tonnes a year. So to stand still, we would need to bury the 37.55 billion tonnes every year, plus the 413 million tonnes added on each year by the growth. That's a perspective, but not to worry at all, because we have an energy minister, Ed Miliband, coming to the rescue, and that man knows how to dig holes. Well, welcome to another video, and this one is on CO2 burying, CO2 storage, in other words, burying plant food. Because, of course, our plants evolved, most of them evolved, our cereals and rice and so on evolved in much higher levels of CO2 than we have today. They evolved in 3 or 4 times the level we have today. And we want to remove the CO2 from them and make sure that we don't continue to have the record crops of cereals and rice that we currently experience in the world. I mean, just look at these figures here. So here we have the cereal production in the world, and as you can see, it has grown and grown and grown. And the interesting thing is, as it's grown, the actual land use hasn't changed much at all. Look at the graph for land use. Terrific story, isn't it? Not all of that is due to CO2, but a substantial portion is due to CO2. Well, let's look at rice now. Well, as you can see here, rice production in the world has just about doubled since 1960. Again, not just the CO2, but a substantial portion of it is. But it's common sense. If you think about it, these plants have been starved of CO2. They evolved in much higher levels. They've been in the CO2 drought for a long time. Actually, mankind's been adding CO2 back to the atmosphere to help them. And that's been a substantial part of this growth. No, we don't want that. We have to put a stop to that. Not only that, we have to spend £22,000 million to do it. This is a priority of our new socialist government, who really don't give a damn about the people, who just give a damn about ideologies like this. Now, if you're about to spend £22 billion on such a stupid scheme, at least you'd say, well, this is the benefit. This is the benefit. But oh, no, they don't say there's a benefit, just pure virtue signaling benefit, because the truth is, applying their own models, their own alarmist, stupid models, you're only be looking at maybe 1 or 2 millionth of a degree centigrade in 50 years' time. In other words, you can't measure the benefit. So we're about to spend 22 billion without being able to measure the benefit. That's the world we're in. But I was invited to go on GB News to discuss this matter, a short time as always, with my opponent Jim Dale. My problem is, and I'm not being rude here, but the man knows nothing about any of these subjects. But let's actually go to the interview with Nana Akua on this, and I will interrupt as we go through to explain my frustration. Yeah. Oh, well, here it is.
Well, Right, so the government have pledged nearly $22 billion to fund projects that capture greenhouse gases from polluting plants and store them underground, under the seabed, as it races to reach a strict climate target that feels like it's been plucked out of thin air. It said that the funding for 2 carbon capture clusters promised over the next 25 years would create thousands of jobs, attract private investment and help the UK meet climate goals. But green groups have warned that the wrong use risks prolonging dependence on fossil fuels. Exactly. So is carbon capture a good thing? Joining me now to debate this, climate scientist Paul Burgess and also senior meteorologist and social commentator Jim Dow. OK, I'm going to start with you. Paul Burgess, carbon capture, we get the idea. Is it safe to store high-pressure carbon near sort of oil and gas fields and things? I thought it would be dangerous. Is it?
Well, it can be, but I mean, I'm sure they would test it and make sure that it's safe in that sense. The problem is that even according to the government, the Ed Miliband's department, it puts the costs up by at least 40%. I mean, up to 40% of a power station's energy can be used just to bury it. So you've now, you need almost double the power stations. That's number one. Number two, it's a failed technology, which has been tried right around the world. And number three, there is that, and failed, by the way, over 80% has failed completely. There's non-commercially viable. And then, of course, if anyone's going to propose this, like Jim, I'm sure it will, then you've got to give me the benefit for it. So you've got to say how much change will there be in temperature, for example? I can tell you the answer. It's in a few millionths of a degree, unmeasurable. So we're spending 22 billion, which, by the way, would support the old age pension and fuel payment for 15 years. But that's the priority of our government.
All right, let's go to Jim Dow. Jim Dow.
Good afternoon, the pair of you. Good to be here. Look, first thing to say, net zero. We're in law. The last government and this government, we've got to get there by 2050. So this is one of the tools. So this is a necessary part of the future. It's a part of the future. Technology moves on. Paul's just said it doesn't work. Well, it's working better. Look, there are better people than me and Paul who are in charge of this particular exercise over the next 25 years, by the way. That's an expenditure of 22 billion is essentially just less than $1 billion a year. So it's not like what's been put across the headlines at all.
Well, I have to stop in there just to get over a few points I don't have time to get over on television. He says we've got to get there, meaning the 2050 net zero deadline. No, we haven't, Jim. That's just a statement. It has no meaning. Technology moves on, he says. Well, it hasn't moved on, Jim. I've looked at the latest research, the latest work on carbon capture and storage, and it's basically a simple process. You have to take the carbon either out of the fossil fuel plant or out of the air. Out of the air is ridiculous, by the way, because the cost is almost the same as the cost in energy is almost the same as what you save. In other words, you produce as much CO2 doing it as what you save. And you say it's working better. No, there's no evidence for that. And better people than you or I. Don't speak for me, Jim. I understand this subject. I am a retired chartered environmental engineer. And as regards the 25 years point, well, the 22 billion is over 25 years, but it's actually front loaded. If you look at the structure here of all the pipes needed to capture all the different industries and capture the CO2 and bury it, that's a very front loaded capital cost. But even if it isn't, if you take the 22 billion, I'm saying 22 billion would have paid for 15 years of the old age pension money you've just taken from them. Right? So you could have kept that going. What this shows is priority or ideology of this government matters above people. And in particular, Ed Miliband's ideology is just so extreme. He will trample over everybody, including the poorest in our society. All this is doing is adding huge extra sums to your electricity and energy costs. Also, in addition, the latest report from Ed Miliband's department makes it clear that we've got to keep all the gas stations open, all the gas stations that don't bury CO2, just the normal gas stations open, past 2050. So to say that the concern is to bury the CO2, that's ridiculous. Nor was that allowed for in the costs. Oh, God, no.
It's creating up to 4,000 jobs, according to the government, and 50,000 support jobs during that period.
I don't believe that figure for a moment about the number of jobs. And the idea of 50,000 support jobs is absurd. Once you're capturing the carbon and burying it, it's relatively straightforward and is not labour intensive. But never mind. Any jobs that are being created are not useful. You see, in economic terms, the only job that matters is the job of building a product or a service, providing a service that other people want. Well, no one wants this. So all this is cost. And you might as well get people to sit in a factory and paint potatoes green. It's as useful as that. So that it's not creating jobs, that's putting a huge tax, a huge burden on the people who actually do create the wealth in our society. So in practice, taking away the 22 billion from the productive parts of society, and that's not the state, that's the parts that actually pay their way and pay for all this, taking that money away from them cost us jobs.
So that's the first thing. And these are industrial wastelands. These are in Merseyside and Teesside. So these are the areas where you want these sort of things. Now, in terms of the actual climate side of things, yes, to a degree in the past, it hasn't worked in the way that probably would. But look, any technology moves on. Any technology gets better with time. And these engineers, these people who are in charge of this, are not stupid. We're not going to commit this sort of money.
That is totally incorrect, Jim. Of course the engineers involved will be paid to do a job. It's as simple as that, and they'll do the job. We've got many, many examples of that right throughout the history of humanity. So that is not a valid point at all. And just saying someone else is clever, I don't know it, but I know someone else is clever, is not a reason for you to argue the case. You're not arguing anywhere here for the actual value of the work you're doing. What is the benefit of all this? The jobs aren't a benefit, they're a cost. What is the benefit of doing it? I mean, we could invent any other things. We could invent painting maypoles or producing maypoles around the country in the millions, and that would employ people. Just employing people doing things that people do not want is not employment.
Something that does not work.
Well, but maybe they would. But Jim, maybe they would. Maybe they would. Isn't it going to be the oil and gas companies that are going to run these projects as well? So they're going to move from oil and gas.
95% of the fossil fuels that these oil and gas companies create, it will be taken out of the air. That's the whole point of this. So it's a win-win exercise.
But it just seems, I'm sort of scratching my head with this because it doesn't seem to make sense to me, Paul, because we don't, how much of it, there's a finite amount of carbon that we actually need. And if we end up capturing too much, then it's going to be detrimental. And I don't really believe we can actually capture it. Paul?
The world economy couldn't even stand it. I mean, if this project works, looking at the figures for Liverpool and Tyneside, looking at those figures, it's 0.0000003% of the world's current carbon thing. It makes no difference at all. What we're doing is spending this money, squandering this money, and it makes no difference at all. So if you're going to spend 22 billion, I don't care over what time it is, if you're going to spend that sort of money, give me the benefit. And if you're measuring that benefit according to their silly models, according to their models, not mine, you're looking at a millionth or 2 millionth of a degree, if that. That's what you're looking at. So where is the benefit, Jim?
Okay, where's the benefit, Jim? You've got about 20 seconds. Where's the benefit?
Okay, so over the time, 54,000 jobs in deprived areas.
But we haven't got the jobs yet, though.
We will take carbon out of the atmosphere. We've got our own reason to do this in terms of net zero. That's what we've got to actually do. So this is going to create jobs. It's going to take CO2. And by God, do we need it? Open your eyes, see what's going on around the world globally at this moment in time.
All right, no, let's not do this. You know how we were going to behave today. Jim Dale, Paul Burgess, thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Right, let's get to my panel, Norman Baker and also Adam Brooks.
You'll notice that, of course, Jim gave no benefit whatsoever, other than we've got to do the mantra, we've got to take it out. But not what difference would the 22 billion make to the world? The answer is not measurable. Not even possibly measurable. And he can't answer that. And this is the absurdity of the world we're in today. We are spending actually not just 22 billion, we're spending trillions on this. And this is going to bankrupt the West, and it has to stop. Now, What's interesting here is a lot of the green movements are against this carbon capture because they don't want the fossil fuel industry to continue anyway. And so next on here on the panel that Nana refers to is an ex-minister actually from the coalition government. He's a Lib Dem, a Liberal Democrat thing, and a person I met and tried to discuss this with them earlier on in the green room without any luck at all. I find these ministers just follow a line, and so what we're going to get now is pure ignorance. I'll just put him on to demonstrate the point of why the Greens don't like carbon capture, because they want to do this pure world without fossil fuels, even though in the current state of the UK today, of our total energy, not just electricity, our total energy, sun and wind energy accounts for 4.8% overall of our energy production.
Right, Norman Bay here. I'll start with you. Carbon capture.
I'm sad about this in a way because climate change is a very serious issue. I do believe that, and I do believe net zero is a sensible policy to aim for, but this isn't the way to do it. This is incoherent, actually, in my view, because it depends on fossil fuels generating carbon in order to capture it.
Right, so let's examine some of the actual facts behind this entire madness of carbon capture. Here we go. The fact is that over 80% of the world's carbon capture projects have completely failed and stopped. The others are none of them commercially viable. So we've had no success whatsoever so far. Now, anyone who knows me knows I like to quote the IPCC, especially when they state things that are opposite to what people think. The entire efficacy of the carbon capture process has been called into question by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change in a special report on carbon dioxide capture and storage. The IPCC themselves stated CO2 storage is CO2 storage is not necessarily permanent. Physical leakages from storage reservoirs is possible via 1. Gradual long-term release, and 2. Sudden release of CO2 caused by disruption of the reservoir. Even the IPCC themselves aren't happy with it. That has not stopped people trying, so we'll take a look at what they've done in Norway. Well, they have just completed, in September 2024, a carbon capture plant called the Northern Lights, and here it is. This costs $2.3 billion, and it stores away 1.5 million tons a year of CO2. I do not have access to the operating costs of all these different projects, and Ed Miliband's project shrouded in mystery at the 22 billion. So here I'm taking the capital cost of this completed plant, just completed in Norway, at $2.3 billion, producing 1.5 million tons a year of buried CO2. So the UK outputs about 406 million tons of CO2 a year. Okay, and one of those Northern Light plants, say, is 1.5 million tons. So you'd need 270 of those plants to cope with the UK output. And by the way, that would cost you 621 billion. But if you put that demand onto the system, it would cost you more than that because resources will start to dry up. So it's a bit like turning up at a fire to an apartment building, and the fire engines are there and they need your help, and you arrive with a water pistol, a kid's water pistol. I mean, all the way through the Ed Miliband world, all the way through net zero world, as soon as you do the figures on batteries, on all sorts of things, it's just like that. So even if you put the 22 billion into that, which they're spending, and they're spending that over 25 years, so it's not a lot. Although it'll be front loaded, most of that would happen at the beginning. Even that is compared to the 621 billion you need. So there's the issues, and it's like, again, children are dealing with this. So I just wanted to put that in perspective with what we know. But the Northern Lights one has to take in the CO2 by trucks and by trains and things from all over the place and then bury it. And it takes a lot of energy to compress it to 2000 psi and bury it. And there are other issues then. There are other issues not to do with explosions. Now, CO2 is not a poisonous gas. It's not. And we breathe it in all the time. However, if a pipe bursts and and CO2 comes out the pipe under pressure, it forms a pool of CO2. And because it's heavier than air, it can drift into different places. And this, of course, has happened in Africa. And in Africa, almost 2,000 people died as the cloud came across the villages, and it killed all the animals and everything. And in America, there was a pipe burst that affected a local town, and with people going around deprived of oxygen, they died from suffocation. So the CO2 arrives, it cuts out the air in effect. So now you're suffocating. The first symptoms are oxygen deprivation. And with that, you start to get delusional. And actually, it can be quite pleasant, apparently, before you die. And so that is what can happen. But I'm not saying that's a high probability even. I'm sure they test it and so on. But a blowout could achieve that. So I'm just giving you some of the things. But this has never worked anywhere. So this plant, the Northern Lights, is going to consume an awful lot of energy to, first of all the trucks and trains bringing it, and then you've got to use all the energy to compress it, and then you've got to have used all the energy to build it. I mean, honestly, I would love to look at the operating costs, which I can't get, because it doesn't make sense. Now I'm quickly going to look into, in general terms, the amount of energy needed to actually run the carbon capture plant and the amount of energy needed to compress the CO2 down to 2000 psi. It's quite a lot, and it depends on how you capture it. Now, if you capture it from the air, you use almost as much energy in capturing and compressing as you do to begin with. You haven't achieved anything. In other words, you've stood still. It's really silly capturing from the air. But if you're capturing from different types of power plants at source, there are different results. And here are some figures here. Okay, this is the energy used to actually capture the CO2 in different types of plant. In a coal plant, you'd use 20 to 25% of the energy in the plant it can produce just to do the capture. So you'd lose, say, a quarter of the energy you're producing. You'd have to reduce the amount going out to the grid by that much. Natural gas is more efficient. You'd use about 15%. You'd lose, that. So you would lose a lot of power from the plant because you'd be capturing it. Mineral storage, which is ridiculous. You can actually use generally more than you gain. It uses more than the plant can produce, so that's out of the question. However, in addition to the energy used to run the CCS equipment, which is what we're talking about there, we've now got to compress the CO2. And we've got to compress it, say, to 2000 psi typically, and they're saying that consumes 90 to 120 kilowatt hours per tonne of CO2. But there is a report on this, and it's here. And here's the graph from that report, given the cost in pounds of capturing a tonne of CO2 against different scenarios. Now, this graph actually has 4 scenarios on it, but there is a footnote, and it says the current uncertainties in the capture and capacity are greater than the differences between those different 4 scenarios. So what we know here is the costs of running in the sort of region of, let's say, £130 a metric ton to around about £350 a metric ton. So it's really that vague what the cost of capture would be. But let's look at those extremes. Let's take the £130 a metric ton and the £350 a metric ton, and look how much it would cost to capture the UK's annual output just to hold still at what we're at the moment. Well, so besides all the capital costs that I've shown you, these enormous capital costs which are unrealistic, it would cost somewhere between 52 billion and 142 billion pounds every year to capture the output from the UK of CO2. So you can see this 22 billion over years is just not feasible. It is the water pistol at the fire. But the whole thing is a non-starter, and the uncertainties are enormous. And that range of cost shows the uncertainties. And the uncertainties are because everyone who's tried it so far has failed. There's no commercially viable carbon capture, but we're happy to spend 22 billion on that and take money away from our old age pensioners, winter fuel allowance, whilst at the same time increasing the price of fuel. We just put it up 10% in October, continuing to increase it with all sorts of extra costs. You see, they don't allow to add on to the cost of the renewable energy, the cost of the £12 billion a year for the pylons that are going to now scour the countryside. They don't allow for the 500 billion to change the network. There's all sorts of things they're not allowing for. I mean, they're treating us like children, these people. The truth is, they're the children, and the children who, are just unbelievable when it comes to trying to figure out the logic of what they're on. All you can conclude is they've got sort of cult in their brain that just has to follow. And of course, all this makes no difference in the world, because the world's CO2, as we know, is growing, and the COP meeting, like every other COP meeting, does not even put a dent in that CO2 curve. In the Northern Lights in Norway, that I've taken as an example, the world emits about 40 billion tonnes a year of additional carbon into the atmosphere, and we'd need to build, if we wanted to capture that, we'd have to build 26,666 Northern Lights, but that would consume most of the world's energy to run them, and if you build one of those Northern Lights a week, it would take 512 years to build them. Recent bit of news, really. I know children are, well, the people in our government, from the Prime Minister down, especially the Chancellor of the Exchequer and the Prime Minister and the Foreign Minister, they're all like children. They're just completely lacking in knowledge, not just on this subject, but many subjects. And they've recently announced that they want to group all the public that's a public sector pension funds into one thing, so they can invest it in new technologies and various things. That's wrong. First of all, it's extremely high risk. In fact, I think the whole wind industry thing is just a scam now. But they don't decide who invests the pension funds, and I think they do, and they don't. So, if I were a public sector worker, I'd be very worried about the government grabbing its hands on your pension funds. I mean, they're terrific pension funds there. I mean, really far better than any private industry. But, just be careful there, because the madness that's now encroaching the brains of our leaders in restricting freedom of speech and arresting people for simple tweets and all this sort of thing has now reached such an extreme that in one way it's good, because it may bring the government down. But the government does need changing. I mean, we are really in a bad situation. So I thought I'd add that little thing that's only just happened as I was making this video to it. You can't let the government decide on how they're going to invest your pension fund. They're not good at that. One thing about governments is they never, ever pick the right industries to invest in, etc. They are lousy at computer systems, and they're lousy at big infrastructure projects. They really are. But they're also lousy at small scheme businesses. No idea at all. Look, if a business was good, it could do it without public money. And I'll wrap up this video with a reminder that, of course, with COP29, just like all the other COPs, they make no difference whatsoever to the growth of CO2 in this world. And this graph shows that. We are led by people who just ignore that, who wants to ruin our economies, control our way of life. What for? For no gain whatsoever.